This is Audiovisual Cultures, the podcast that explores different areas of the arts and cultural production with me, Paula Blair. Visit patreon.com/AV Cultures to find out more and to join the pod. This is a run through of a talk I'm going to give to a Friends MA module called Language in Film and Television. My presentation is called Selling Democracy, Examining Language in No. I've been doing some comparative research on the use of archival footage in the 2012 films No and Good Vibrations, and this was by way of expanding outwards and starting to do comparative studies from my research on film and visual culture in contemporary post-agreement, inverted commas, post-conflict Northern Ireland. And the comparison was to examine the ways cultural products dealing with the past, so these two feature films that deal directly with the past, so they're based on true stories, they're versions, they're imaginings of a truth, they're not trying to be truthful or give accurate accounts, but they both are grounded in actual history by use of archival material. And I wanted to examine the different ways that they both do that, and I've been doing that recently on my blog. Before I left academia, that was an article I was working on with intention to send it to a journal, but things went very wrong and I got very ill, and it's taken me a few years to find my way back to it and try to do something with that, because it was at quite a late stage of drafting that all of that happened, and I'd done so much research that I wanted to try and revive that again. Also thinking about it in light of, because No is about the referendum, the plebiscite in Chile that resulted in a return to democracy of a kind. And I think just seeing that, thinking about that again in the light of what's happened in the UK after the EU referendum and a very slim majority wanting to leave without really knowing what that is. And I think in No it's about a not just so slim majority wanting to move into democracy, but again not necessarily quite knowing what they're voting for. So just some very broad reduced context of history-ish of Chile. The Republic of Chile is a former colony of Spain. It has a long history of resistance to any kind of rule from the Mapuches, the indigenous people of that part of Latin America. They lived independently from the Incas when the region was under Inca rule, and then when Spain colonized, again they continued to have a very successful resistance and live independently from the colony. And then in 1818 Chile was declared independent and a republic in its own right, and then in around 1880 the republic had essentially quashed the Mapuches. They were really very marginalized, they were beaten back, and things have really changed substantially for them in the past 140 years. Geographically, because I think that's important, and I'll talk a little bit in more depth about the geography of Chile in a bit. It's a long strip on the southern cone that is surrounded by natural frontiers. So in the north it's got the Atacama Desert, which is the driest place on earth. To the west it's got the South Pacific and many islands off the west coast. To the east it's really shaped in the east by the Andes and bordered by Argentina on the east. And then on the south, that very south, because it curls around the south of the cone, that southern part is really bordered by the Antarctic. Across this long strip of a country, you've got really extreme temperatures and real extremes in humidity in this one country. The different parts of it just have very differing geographical features, and so those natural frontiers make it shaped a bit like an island, even though it's part of a really huge subcontinent. And it's really interesting if you look at the film by Patricio Guzman, The Pearl Button, he goes through that geography and describes it as very similar to an archipelago, really because of the islands, and it's the islands where a lot of the Mapuches still are, and they're really quite pushed out and marginalized. There's not just so many of them in mainland Chile anymore. Industrially, Chile is probably best known for its mineral resources. It's a major global exporter of copper and lithium. I mean, so many of our batteries and things, anything you have that is run by batteries, the lithium has very likely come from Chile, and probably similar with a lot of the copper that we all use and that is in all of our basic appliances and things. In the early 1970s, I think the election was 1969 or 1970, under democracy, a socialist government was elected with Salvador Allende as president. And in 1973, this was overthrown in quite a shock military coup. Then the junta that followed this, that was led by General Augusto Pinochet, ruled for 16 years. And during that time, thousands of people were killed or disappeared or interned and tortured in detention camps, or they were exiles. And particularly the exile, that's an important point when we think about no. This is in part a reason why I am very interested in the comparison between Northern Ireland and Chile, because I think a lot of that geography, but a lot of those figures, I think I've crunched the numbers a bit, and if you look at the likes of population size and then percentages of how many people this involves, it's quite similar in number, even though the scales are vastly different. And so I think it's really useful, I think, in terms of affectivity and I suppose having empathy for each other and seeing those connections where people are marginalised and they're fighting for the rights, the culture that comes from that, and the ways that we use cultural products like films to try and come to terms with the past and try and hold account to the past. Even when we might be on the side of a thing, it's not necessarily a good or the best thing. It's really quite a tricky one ethically, this one. So No, directed by Pablo Larraín, and this is really the third in his loose Pinochet trilogy, released in 2012. It's a critical reimagining of the plebiscite held in 1988, looking specifically at the No campaign. And so the No vote was to say no to 8 more years of Pinochet automatically without an election, and No won by, I think it was a 56% electorate majority. There was a general election in 1990 and Pinochet lost. A concertación government, so a coalition socialist government, was then fairly consistent until recent years. So we're thinking about the way that this film looks back to that past. This session is really about thinking through different approaches to language in this film, I think from a more very, very broad strokes linguistic point of view, which is the angle the module is coming at. This is for. So some general discussion points around this. I've got subtitling in there, but I'm not really going to get into that myself, but that's something I'm encouraging the class to look at. But things I will point out, things like cultural currency and what does that mean, what does that communicate, accents and exiles, because I think just looking at Gael Garcia Bernal is really important for that, and why casting him is so significant. And then communication through song and dance, and thinking about Indigenous people and their languages. What I'm really going to focus on in the rest of the session, I'll look at it a bit in the presentation, but then when I move on into looking at the film and sequences from a film, we're going to look at film language, because that's probably where I come in really as the outsider to the class, is thinking through aspects of film language that students from a linguistic point of view won't necessarily have the terminology for. So to think about international cultural currency, what do I mean by that? Just looking specifically at the star of the film, Gael Garcia Bernal, he's probably the only actor in the film that would be internationally recognisable. The rest are all very well known in Chile, but not really well known unless you specifically seek out Chilean film. And so Gael Garcia Bernal brings a huge amount of star power. People will go to see No in the cinema because it's a Gael Garcia Bernal film. He has that kind of attraction. But also he's important because actors can be intertexts. They bring baggage with them from their previous projects. And I think specifically in this, because as we'll look at in a bit, his character René Saavedra, one of the ways that he traverses Santiago and surrounding areas is on a motorcycle. And one of the things Garcia Bernal will have been famous for at this point is starring as the young Ernesto Che Guevara in the Motorcycle Diaries from 2004. There's just an evocation there of this guy has played revolutionaries before, and I think René is an accidental revolutionary in a way because he really wants to stay out of it and he gets embroiled in it. His character is very interesting because he's an amalgamation of many different people. He's an individualized fiction of lots of different people who ran the campaign. I think through him, that's where the marketing language is really dissected and investigated, it's probed, and I think the film takes a skeptical in the sense of stepping back and looking at the details, considering the evidence, using skeptical in that way. When I say he takes a skeptical look at such a character. He's also somebody who's multilingual. He brings a lot with him because we've seen him in Francophone and Anglophone films quite a lot too. He's really recognisable. Also importantly for this film, he's distinctive because of his Mexican accent, and that's really important because his character René Saavedra has been in exile. He is a returned exile, so that's notable, and he's somebody who is in stark contrast to people he encounters of his father's generation and who know his father, who end up walking out of the campaign he's leading because they're so disgusted at the marketing language that he brings to it and the way he's packaging and selling the idea of happiness through democracy. He's somebody who doesn't quite sit right with everyone. So he's this insider-outsider. He's got this ambivalent personality that all comes through in his Mexican accent. So to think a bit more about that, I think there's a sense of betrayal from his father's contemporaries and colleagues and friends. You get the sense that because this is somebody who's referred to as being known well by the leaders of the No campaign, it's likely that this person is a known socialist. He's talked about in present tense, which is an indication that either he is a disappeared person and they don't know what's happened to him, or this is somebody who's still in exile. He remains in exile, presumably in Mexico, because it's not safe. But we don't get the details of that. This is just something unspoken that is implied that we just have to make conclusions about from knowing the context. I think it is very important to just stress that he is a combination of lots of different real people, and there's not really a personal criticism on any one person. It's really just taking a critical look at the campaign and how it operated and how the ads went, because it resulted in democracy, but what kind of flavour of democracy was it? And again, this is where there's a similarity with the Northern Ireland peace agreement in that it's a very uneasy peace and there are things that people have had to let go that really cause a lot of harm, and I think something very similar has happened in democracy coming to Chile, where it hasn't necessarily been better for everybody. So just a little bit more on accents. I think it's notable that on the Yes campaign, the initial, I'm not sure if the name of the characters ever actually said, and I haven't managed to clarify this through searches, but the guy who seems to be initially leading the Yes marketing campaign is Argentinian, and so he is presented as a sympathetic outsider from a parallel political situation in the bordering country. So this is 1988, and earlier in that decade, Argentina had recently emerged from its own military dictatorship, and it was in substantial international debt. And so I think the idea here is that the character in presenting to the Yes board, on which there are military leaders, there are very right-wing politicians, this is somebody who is telling them quite candidly, we wish we had a Pinochet because our country's in a bit of a mess now since we moved back to democracy rather than dictatorship. And so you guys are super lucky and we're super jealous. So it's that attitude that he brings to it. He has a very romantic vision of life under dictatorship because he is from the status quo. He is not somebody who would be in any way marginalised or his rights impinged on. Those are more things that are very useful to think about in terms of aspects of language. So if we think then about national cultural currency, now a really fascinating part of No, and one of the reflexive things that it does is you have real people coming in and re-performing those earlier versions of themselves. So an example is Patricio Bañados, who was very well known, very recognisable in Chile, a broadcast journalist from a left side of the political spectrum. You need to check the details if you want to look into this more yourself. As far as I'm aware, he was somebody who hadn't really been allowed to work properly for a while. He was somebody who was suppressed by the dictatorship, and so he is recruited by the No campaign to do a lot of the presenting of the No television segments. So this idea that they had 15 minutes a day in the run up to the election, so he was doing a lot of work with those. And it's really interesting because you have scenes where it has the actual man playing himself about 23 years earlier. That's just one example. There are loads of examples of this because a lot of the players in the No video, so a lot of the singers, a lot of the actors, they come back and they re-perform, and they have recreated costumes, and they're all of course visibly older because they're all supposed to be reasonably young and carefree in the videos, and of course they're 20 odd years older, and so that's clear. Young people who were say in their 20s before first time round, they're now in their mid 40s and 50s and so on, and so everybody looks visibly older, and so there's a very conscious device happening here where it's this collapse of the past and the present. For me anyway, they evoke this feeling of it's still not over, they're still campaigning for this. It's still very much in the present because things are not as they should be for society. So there's a lot of that. There are a lot of recognisable people from the real world in this film as well. If we think about that then, because if we think about the archival footage, we have something that's really very poignant in the film, and we can think about dance as language and what that communicates. So if we think about La Cueca, I'm not sure of the pronunciation there, so forgive me if I'm getting that wrong. This is a dance that depicts a courting ritual. I think specifically it's between a rooster and a hen. The idea is that it's associated with rural labourers, so it's the courtship between a farmer and a rural woman. This is something that was appropriated by Pinochet's dictatorship. It was declared as the national dance of Chile in 1979. So this is a good 6 years into the dictatorship, and awful atrocities happening to the people, lots of oppression of rural people. There's an absence of men because it's mostly men who are the ones who get arrested, get interned or disappeared and so on, just at the merest hint that they could be dissenters. A protest to this was the women who were, say, the spouses of men who had been killed or disappeared or exiled, the spouses to people who had been lost to the dictatorship in some way. They would dance this courting dance alone and visibly alone in collectives, and so this is something that is used to very poignant effect in the campaign, and it's focused on a bit during the film. And I think specifically Rene isn't happy about the inclusion of this because he's trying to paint a picture of the joy that will come to Chile when they vote for democracy. He's very much of the school of let's move on and forget the past, shall we? I think in part because he's been shielded from it. He's been very far away in Mexico, which is very far north from Chile. It feels like a world away. It's a whole subcontinent away. He's been very distant from the whole thing, but also economically it doesn't affect him. His life doesn't change. He's not really even that interested, and he keeps complaining that everything's a drag. He doesn't like the pulling of the heartstrings that this does. He doesn't want people to feel sad. He wants people to feel joyous, and he wants to manipulate them into buying no as a product, buying into no basically. Again, thinking about more marginal ways of communicating, the Mapuches, they make up something like 85% of the Indigenous people in Chile. And I highly recommend, if you watch the Pearl Button, there's quite a lot from them in interviews where, you know, they speak their own language and explaining. I think there's some, I need to rewatch it actually. If I remember correctly, they talk quite a bit about really having to cling on to their own language and it being very marginalised, and that Spanish is really taking over. And specifically in the film No, their absence is notable. There's an absence of them visually, but references to them are very much implied. So the Mapuches, they are talked about and very derogatory language is used about them, specifically by Lucho Guzman, who is the boss of Rene in the advertising company that they seem to work for. He also becomes the leader of the Yes campaign, so Rene's equivalent on Yes. When he's talking about the Mapuches to one of the other Yes campaign leaders, he uses homophobic and racist slurs. There's an acknowledgement of the erasure of Indigenous peoples in the mise-en-scène, so in the decor of a restaurant that we see Rene and Lucho in early on. There's a jungle-like setting. It's not fully clear, but there's a figure that's quite possibly Inca or a Mapuche, but it's quite a fetishized image of a native, that idea. So again, there's just this acknowledgement that there's erasure of these people going on. They don't have a voice, but they're fetishized for a themed restaurant, for example. So again, they're used to buy and sell. Notably, when the first televised campaigns go out and there's a long sequence in which everybody's watching the No one and then straight after the Yes video, there's a part in the Yes segment with Rapa Nui children singing for Pinochet. So some of the lyrics in this song are Mahu Ariki Nui. There's a child, you see her visibly crying as she's singing these words. In Maori, this means Hailed Great Lord. I think it's appropriated as quite a patriotic bent. There's footage of this child who's very scantily clad. She's in traditional Maori dress, traditional Polynesian dress, of the general hugging and kissing her. In the context in which this is presented, you don't know why this girl's crying. I think in the montage that it's put into, it's presented as if she's just so proud, but you don't know if she's crying because she's made to do this and she's actually miserable. Who knows? Or did it mean so much to her? And then he's on a photo opportunity where he needs to look like, well, I love all of my peoples, including these Polynesian people on Easter Island, which is a geopolitical territory of Chile's. So there's a very propagandist thing going on. It's, does he actually care about Indigenous people? Well, he certainly goes to great lengths to look as if he does. And I think this is very notable because if you look in contrast at the No campaign, there's an absence. These people aren't there at all. Yes, acknowledge them, and they acknowledge them in quite negative ways or presented as positive but actually very appropriating ways. And this is so important because No just doesn't acknowledge them. You would think that Yes being shown to be derogatory towards them would imply that the No leftist people would be true socialists and that they are fighting the corner of the Indigenous people as well, but they're just completely absent. And so I think that absence, that silence, is amplified by the fact that they're actually acknowledged, at least, even if it is in derogatory ways, by the Yes campaign. So I think there's actually quite a lot to unpick there. And so just to think then a little bit more about that geography. So if you're watching on the video on screen, I've got a map view of Chile in the South Pacific. You can really see the difference because marked by the pin is where Easter Island is, or Rapa Nui, and how very far away from Santiago it is and mainland Chile. You can also just see this series of islands that Chile breaks down into there too, and then it's just this long strip along the bottom cone, and it breaks up into many, many islands. I think it's interesting to point this out from a language point of view, because if you look up some information on Rapa Nui today, it seems like Spanish is becoming increasingly popular as a language, and Maori less so. And I think politically, if it's of interest, if you want to explore this further, I've written about this in a blog recently, just tracking the quite severe swings between left and right in the government of Chile. And it's interesting because in Chile, the same president cannot hold office 2 terms in a row. So I think in a way, from a very uninformed point of view, I'm suggesting that it feels like there's just this continual every 4 years passing between right and left, right and left, right and left governments, because you can't return the same president for 2 terms in a row. You can return the same president innumerable times, but they just can't hold office 2 terms in a row. And if somebody's really popular, so it has been passing between the same 2 people for a while now. So it's been a socialist and then a billionaire right winger, and back and forth for a bit. It's indicative of a country that today doesn't really know where it stands on these things. It can't settle, and then there's no type of government that can really get a good run at things to maybe address issues. The Socialist Coalition, different parties made this up, and that's why you've got that 6-banded rainbow, because those colours each represent the 6 parties involved in the coalition. They, between them, were in power for, let's say, from 1990 until, was it 20, I can't remember now the year, but I think definitely 2010 somebody right wing was voted in. I remember that because it was the same year that David Cameron became Prime Minister in the UK with the coalition government. So I think for nearly 20 years, don't quote me on that, do check, but I think for a good block of time it was passed between different socialist parties. I think there was tremendous frustration at the idea of, well, we're just going to throw up a monument to these things and then not really ever deal with anything that happened. And so I think a lot of people got off scot-free, including Pinochet himself. I mean, he remained leader of the army for a good few years, and then when he retired, he was wanted in many countries, and he was arrested in London at one point, but he never was charged for anything. He was never charged for his crimes and his human rights abuses. He got away with everything, and he died in 2004. He got off scot-free, so, and no one from his administration, as far as I'm aware, has ever encountered any justice for anything that happened. There's just a huge amount going on in this one film that you could go off and explore, keeping it relevant to thinking about language. You know, it's really important to think then about, I think, the song sequences in those parts with the Rapa Nui language, the Maori language songs, because they come up in the subtitles. I think no matter what language you have your subtitles in, they come up in the Roman characters. It's the Maori that you're reading, so you don't actually know what is being said in the song. So this is something I had to search for and figure it out. I think there's nothing from the Mapuches speaking at all in it. So thinking then about where I come in with thinking about language, so thinking about the film language in this. So I've already mentioned things like elements of the mise-en-scène, specifically decor. So what are we talking about when we say reading film language? So the 4 main areas to break down is cinematography, editing, mise-en-scène and sound. So the cinematography is everything to do with the camera. So that includes where it's positioned, proximity, what kind of focus has it got, what kind of lens has it got, what kind of camera is it? Is it digital? Is it film? Is it 16mm? Is it 35? What's the focus like? Is there a focus rack? Is it on a zoom? Is it not? Is it moving? Is it static? What kind of movement is it? Is it panning? Is it dollying? Is it zooming? Is it dolly zooming? So there's loads of areas to go with that. With editing, we're thinking about everything to do with how the film is put together and plays out on screen. This is the cutting. What way is it cut? What kind of transitions are we seeing? Are we thinking about in-camera editing? Are we thinking about editing styles? Are we thinking about very long takes? Or are we thinking about lots of cuts happening in a short space of time? What is the structure of the film? Those sorts of questions. Then with mise en scène, this is everything we can see in the frame. And so this includes lots of elements. So this includes the colours that we're seeing. It includes the actors, where actors or things are positioned, so they're blocking. It can include where they are relative to the camera at any time. The props, the decor, the lighting. Is there shadow? Is there not? What's going on with costumes? What are people wearing? Where are they? What's their location? What's their setting? Are they inside? Are they outside? What sort of building is it? What sort of place are they in? All of those sorts of things. So absolutely everything that you see is the mise en scène. Then with sound, with the audio, this is everything you can hear, and this could be music, and this can be diegetic or non-diegetic or extra diegetic music and dialogue. It can be sound effects, is there a voiceover, whether it's in stereo or mono, what the balance is. And I think the balance is a really interesting one with No, because if you haven't already, I highly recommend watching No with headphones on, because some very interesting stuff is going on in the sound balance. It switches between your ears depending on what you're seeing, and I think there's something in that relationship. Those are the sorts of things that we're thinking about, because all of these things on their own and working in conjunction with each other, they all communicate loads of stuff without the film actually blatantly telling you things. Just some examples from this. So earlier I had mentioned, when I was talking about cultural currency, I mentioned that Gael Garcia Bernal had starred in The Motorcycle Diaries, and I think it's pretty significant that one of his vehicles of choice, and the one that we see him use the most in No as Renee Saavedra, is a motorcycle. So I want to think about, well, what kind of vehicle is this? It's a solitary use vehicle, pretty much. It has connotations of being alone, being strong, being independent, being free. And free is the key word, because it's a sense of freedom and happiness through freedom that Renee sells as an advertising designer and executive. So on screen, if you're seeing it, is a still from the film of him on the open road. He's quite central in the frame. He's outside the city of Santiago. He's on his way to a beach house where they're all going to get together and discuss the campaign. Okay, so there's this evocation then of freedom. So he's on a country road. He's flanked by trees and countryside. And so I think this is a really notable image of Renee. This is one of the ways that we can start to learn about his character through looking at the ways in which he moves through space. So another one, this next shot I want to look at, is a shot of Renee on another one of his vehicles of choice, the skateboard. So what kind of vehicle is this? Well, it's a single occupancy vehicle. Again, it's a sequence in which he is in a very carefree way just sailing on down the road. He's weaving around things. It's a very 80s sense of freedom as well, because I mean, I for one, I can't really look at especially a grown man on a skateboard and not think about Back to the Future, not think about Marty McFly, especially with the jeans and the type of trainers that Renee Saavedra is wearing at this point, you know, and the shirt hanging out from under his jacket, the very 80s hair. He's got this little tiny, it's not even a ponytail, it's just this little very 80s. His hair is verging on a mullet, and then just this one long length of hair in the middle, and so you can see that a bit from the back view of him on the skateboard. And so again, there's just this characterization of him as a lone wolf type character. He traverses space with ease. He's very comfortable with being on his own, you know, even though he has a small child child. He's very often leaving him with the nanny. He doesn't use his car all that often, so he has a car and I think it's referenced more than he actually uses it. You see him more in the skateboard and the motorcycle, and he's never carrying anything. He never has a bag or anything, even though he's supposedly working on stuff all of the time. He's very mobile, and so I get this idea, especially when we see him on the skateboard and he's weaving around. He's not really holding a straight line or anything, and it's very early on in the film when we see him on the skateboard. I think it's this idea of his mobility and the ease with which he moves. He veers left and right because I think he's very malleable at this point. I think he becomes more rigid as the film goes along, and he's in more, the motorcycle and the car, you need to stick to your lane basically, whereas in this he's in his lane but he's veering around. So I think that's pretty significant, and that's a clip that with the class I want to look at, try to do a sequence analysis on this, because other things going on here are there's a lot of sun flare. Okay, so there's this idea that it's very early morning, it's a very bright sun. We're southern hemisphere, so I guess it's spring in October. So I think this is a very springtime sun, if I'm right about that. Very long shadows, lots of sun flare going on. The camera is very mobile. We see Renee from a lot of different angles, and importantly, this is one example of many where the camera crosses the line. Okay, it crosses the invisible, both the 180 and 30-degree rule lines. It's quite disorientating. It's just a little bit jarring. It's not hugely jarring because I think this happens where the camera's actually moving. It's not cutting when it does this, but it's jarring in the sense that your position is changed and your point of view of looking at Renee is changed within the shot. So I think again there's something going on there that really needs to be probed a bit more. So this is a point where for the class that I'll be running, I intend to then have a more general discussion, and if anybody has any specific questions about anything, that's where I will want to draw on those, and then also look at sequence analysis and look at parts that I think are very notable and demonstrate those issues in film language that I think are important and should be useful to bring to a module that's coming from more of a linguistic point of view. Some recommended viewing if you want to try to get up to speed on a lot of these broader issues in Chile. I highly recommend just about any film by Patricio Guzman, but I think especially The Pearl Button and Nostalgia for the Light. Really very beautiful, deeply moving, and quite difficult to watch at times, but highly worth it. Films from 2010 and 2015, and he himself is an exile and has been living in Europe since the early 70s, but also from the 1970s, the Battle of Chile. I think they're really important films to try and get up to speed with a lot of the issues that would help fill out the backdrop. I'd also recommend Tony Manero and Postmortem, which again are very difficult films to watch but are really worth watching if you get through them, and they are the first two of this Luz Pinochet trilogy from Pablo Larraín. They're all linked by the actor Alfredo Castro, who plays Lucho Guzman, the leader of the Yes campaign in No. He plays the lead character in Tony Manero, who is obsessed with Tony Manero in the film Saturday Night Fever, and he's a bit of a microcosmic look at a type of dictator character, and he's also in Postmortem as a morgue worker who falls in love with, I think she's a dancer who seems to be a revolutionary. So those are very difficult views, but they're really worth watching if you can. And for the class I've also supplied a bit of a reading list that isn't on here. A few details on the last side, just if people want to get in touch and check out the rest of what I do, including a link to my blog where I have been writing about No quite recently. Thank you very much for visiting my page. This has been a Cozy Pea Pod production with me, Paula Blair. The music is Common Ground by Airtone, used under a Creative Commons 3.0 non-commercial license, and is downloadable from ccmixter.org. Episodes release every other Wednesday. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your podcasts. See the show notes for a video link if you need auto captions. Be part of the conversation with AV Cultures on Facebook and Twitter, or AV Cultures Pod on Instagram. As well as Patreon membership, one-off support is appreciated at buymeacoffee.com/PEA Blair. I produce and edit the show by myself, and I am grateful for any support for this work. For more information and episode links, visit audiovisualcultures.wordpress.com. Thank you so much for listening. Catch you next time.